I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello horror hounds, welcome to my horror house. 1970 was a bit of a glut year for Hammer vampire movies. A few months after the release of Taste the Blood of Dracula, we get Scars of Dracula, and then later on in that year The Vampire Lovers, and then very early in 1971, January 1971 I think, Lust for a Vampire gets released. 4 Hammer vampire movies, hot on the heels, one after the other. Something has to get lost in the shuffle, and I suspect, with the best will in the world, it's Scars of Dracula. There are certainly things to like in Scars of Dracula, and we'll definitely get to those, but they do seem to be like little diamonds in the rough. Sadly, the much admired continuity, certainly admired by me, the continuity that had been kept up throughout these Dracula films in the franchise gets jettisoned. I did read somewhere that Scars of Dracula was supposed to be a kind of reboot of the Dracula franchise. Hammer had been trying to work out what I guess I would call the Christopher Lee problem for many films now. How can we have a Dracula franchise without Christopher Lee, who's at best reticent to return to the part and at the worst very outspoken and vocal against the work he's being asked to do, against a public and production and distribution companies who want to see and fund Dracula movies with Christopher Lee in them. They've been trying to work out this problem ever since Brides of Dracula, the second film in the franchise, and it's a nut that they never crack. I also find it really strange that they're attempting what I guess now we might call a reboot of the franchise only months after Taste the Blood of Dracula had hit theatres. But there you go. Once Lee was on board though, a hastily written resurrection scene was conceived and tacked on to the start of the movie, and it does really seem out of place. It's what instantly signposts you to the fact that this movie doesn't fit in anywhere really. The last we left Christopher Lee's count, he was a pile of ashes most certainly, but on an altar in a London church, and now here he's back in time, he's back in his whatever Hammer Germanic country they're choosing to set this in at this time, and with the aid of a handy helper bat, a huge rubber bat that will fly in and recycle a resurrection method from previous movies. It'll sick up some blood on him and bring him back to life, and hey presto, Christopher Lee is back as Drac. It's a little bit like the Never Say Never Again of Hammer's Dracula series. Sure, it's got the famous and original lead in place, but it sort of sits off to the side on its own, not really a part of any of the rest of the films in the canon. It's also made up in part of cut and paste copies of other scenes from the Dracula franchise. So when those jar against the truly original or shocking or outstanding bits in the movie, it makes it a very frustrating and uneven watch. So when the bat comes in to Dracula's sepulchre and vomits or dribbles up his blood onto his red ashes and resurrects him, we're all familiar with this. The Count is brought back to life in a series of really unconvincing dissolves, especially when you look back to the amazing resurrection sequence in Dracula, Prince of Darkness. Apparently here, Dracula can now resurrect his clothes as well as his body. And as Dracula stands from his altar and walks over to the castle window at the bat flapping off, even he seems to silently be thinking, well, that was a bit weird. At least we don't have to sit through 45 minutes of the movie until Dracula is resurrected, as we've been made to get used to. So there is that. It's up and running. And I do get a kick out of a film like this, a gothic horror movie, where at the very start of the movie, the villagers decide to rise up with their pitchforks and their burning torches and go and burn down the castle. As it is here, the villagers in the shadow of Castle Dracula have had enough, and they march on the castle and they burn it down to the ground right at the start of the movie. What we get because of that is really the legacy of those actions. We see Dracula's amazing and vicious revenge on the village for daring to challenge his authority. And we kind of see how these villagers become so reticent, bent, broken to the will of Dracula, like the guys in The Slaughtered Lamb in American Werewolf in London. How did these people become like this? Well, we get to see what happens when they try and challenge that big monster in the castle on top of the hill. It doesn't go well for them. So naturally, years later, when our young nominal heroes ride into the village, Paul, it's always a Paul trying to find a place to stay for the night. They don't want to help him. They kick him out. Strangers bring questions. Questions bring the attention of things in the night that we don't want their attention. We don't want them turning their eyes on us anymore. We just want to live quietly in the shadow of the castle and hope that we don't attract the attention of these beings. In a weird way, a lot of the cogs from Anthony Hines' script then is lifted from the script of Psycho. You have Paul, a man on the run from the law, like Marion Crane is at the start of Psycho, and she goes to spend a night, and as he does, in a place where they shouldn't, and they come to a sticky end. Then it was in Psycho, Marion's sister and Sam Loomis, the detective, turn up at the Bates Motel. Here it's Paul's brother and his fiancée who turn up to the village to inquire about, start poking around to try and find out what happened to Paul, and they too end up at the castle and face Dracula / mother. I mean, there's even a scene, okay, it's set in a bedroom, but not a shower room, where Dracula pulls back the curtain of the four-poster bed with a dagger and stabs someone to death. The film spends quite a lot of time with Paul, and at the start seems like a weird kind of British sex comedy. Paul is in his own British sex comedy movie where he's bedding the Burgermeister's daughter and then having to run away from the law enforcers, and he's jumping in and out of windows and in and out of bedrooms and into carriages and things like that, and he's always going out of the frying pan into seemingly someone else's bed, and you can just almost hear himself think, you know, as he lands on his feet once again with a pretty young maid waiting to take him in. Paul, my old son, you've done it again. Right up until the point where he finds himself spending a night in Dracula's castle. Even there, the female bride figure of Tanya, another character lifted from a previous sort of franchise, and other scenes lifted from previous entries into the franchise where she goes and begs him for help and says that Dracula is keeping him prisoner and then tries to drink from him. Even there, while he's thinking, well, this is all a bit weird, but yeah, it's perfectly natural, he thinks, for this woman to want to have sex with me because I'm Paul, and this is what happens to Paul in Paul's brilliant life. Well, Paul's brilliant life is about to get a rude awakening. It's actually really hilarious to watch him turn up at Castle Dracula and as, I guess, nominally an alpha male in his own mind, cock of the walk, the big I am, and then to be faced with just a conversation with Dracula, a completely different type of alpha, an apex predator who doesn't respond to him in any of the ways that he's normally used to. Cold, aloof, austere, noble, just something really. It's the kind of authority that a predator has. Imagine a really still lion that you're facing. It's like, why is it so still? And when is it going to stop being still? I'm in real trouble here. And it's lovely watching the confidence sort of drain out of Paul's face. This cocky, swaggering young cocksure idiot suddenly going, I think I might be in a little bit of trouble here. Dracula doesn't take too kindly to Tanya visiting Paul in the night in the castle. So as I alluded to earlier, in a really shocking scene, it is quite shocking to see Dracula stab someone to death. And one of the things that this film is notorious for in the Dracula franchise is the level of violence, the level of sadistic violence that is meted out. Dracula's revenge on the villagers for, daring to attack his authority is to send a swarm of bats down into the village and basically just slaughter the women and children that they've left in the church, assuming that they'd be safe in the church. I mean, it is a bloody red vengeance. So Dracula kills Tanya in a very personal way, and I actually think it's quite cool to see him stab her to death. You're not even worth me draining your blood. Later on, he punishes his manservant Clove. Clove again lifted, a character sort of lifted, at least the name, and his job title lifted from Prince of Darkness. Clovis is Dracula's human manservant, but here a much shabbier Igor type figure, played brilliantly by Patrick Troughton, who has conflicting desires. He's not the cold ramrod straight ghoul-like Clove from Prince of Darkness, who will unquestioningly, unswervingly do his master's will. This Clove has an agency of his own and is resentful of the Count as well, and at turns can disobey orders or try and eke out an agency of his own, which brings on the vicious whippings. We see whip scars across his back, but then there's a very famous scene where Dracula takes an ancient sword and heats it red hot in the fire and lays it across Clove's back. Dracula is a vicious, mean SOB in this movie. When you finally find out what happened to Paul when Paul's brother and his fiancée arrive at the castle, because it's sort of we see Paul's night in Castle Dracula. We know he came to a sticky ending, but we don't know what it is. When it's finally revealed, it's a shot that wouldn't really be out of place. In a Texas Chainsaw Massacre type movie, someone hanging off a butcher's hook or a spike on the wall or something like that. These are Hammer trying to achieve levels of that type of current modern day extreme horror cinema that wasn't really their purview in previous decades. The budget is clearly shoestring. I mean, I watched this on DVD and I'm glad to have it. It's got an extra disc with a bonus feature, The Many Faces of Christopher Lee, on it. So extra stuff about Christopher Lee is not to sniff at. But even on DVD, the set dressing of the interiors of Castle Dracula look awful. I mean, I hate to say it, but slapdash, rushed, cheap. There's no consistent vision there. It does very much seem like, right, what have we got in the props room and what can we stick around here? And let's make it look like a horror movie. We'll have as many red things as possible here. The exteriors of the castle are painfully obvious models, just shot in such a way as to make it clear that they're models, leading unfortunately to a laughable finale where our King of the Vampires falls from the battlements of Castle Dracula, only for us to cut to a long shot of a cheap cardboard model with a tiny little thing on cotton wool bud on fire on a bit of string, slowly being lowered down as you can hear Christopher Lee going, ah. But there are other things to love here. It's Clove who finds the picture of the young lady and fixates on her, not Dracula. Dracula is too cold and austere for this, and it's lovely to have Clove essentially fall in love with the photograph of her, so that when she actually physically arrives at the castle and is in imminent danger, he finds the motivation to go against the will of his master to try and save this woman. It's fantastic to see them try and incorporate at least Dracula's spider climb up the outside wall of the castle from Stoker's novel, and the creation of a room in Castle Dracula that has no doors in or out but just one window set so high up the castle wall that Dracula can easily come in and out in the form of a battle, just as we've seen climb up the walls, but other characters have to tie bedclothes together and lower them down from the bedroom above and climb down, and then the rope can get pulled up and they can get trapped in here. Absolutely fantastic, phenomenal hiding place for an immortal vampire to be safe against pretty much any attack. And I'm amazed we don't often see its like. It just goes to show the sinister and evil planning and forward planning that Dracula has in this. So yeah, Dracula's cold, he's calculating, he's imperious. Then with flashes of rage and emotion, if you cross him, Christopher Lee gets a lot to say and a lot to do in this movie. The movie around him, though, is a hodgepodge patchwork of other things, and a really low-budget, shabby, shoddy affair. There are bits in it to love, and the rest of it's a really shabby affair that's almost an embarrassment. So frustratingly uneven. So while Lee's doing the absolute best he can, and Dennis Waterman as the male lead, I can't even remember the character's name, is so far out of his depth as our nominal hero. As with an awful lot of these perhaps lesser Hammer movies, the plaudits go to the character actors that have people. I've mentioned Patrick Troughton as Clove. It's a phenomenal performance, really quite nuanced, a character that has many and conflicting motivations, and whose motivations change depending on the circumstances and what has happened in the movie. A character you can loathe in one scene and feel empathy for in another one. But king of them all, someone I haven't mentioned in these Hammer reviews yet, who Hammer fans will know and love, is the great Michael Ripper, a very welcome and familiar face in these movies. He's usually playing sort of the jolly pub landlord, the friendly villager type who helps our heroes. Sometimes he's the spokesperson of the villagers who want the outsiders to just go away. Here we see the perfect evolution of how these people come to be. At the start of the movie, he's riled, he rallies the troops. He leads an uprising against the Count and the attack on Castle Dracula. After the Count's hideous revenge against the families, the women and the children left in the church, including Michael Ripper's wife, he's an absolutely broken man. He gets his own little mini arc showing how these cliched slaughtered lamb type characters from American Werewolf in London that get to be so hostile to outsiders and visitors, how they get to be so unwilling to lift a finger to help the so-called heroes of this particular story. Michael Ripper, as a lifelong Hammer fan, we owe you a great debt, and here possibly is your greatest role. That alone makes Scars of Dracula worth recommending.